They say the Druids vanished, swallowed by Roman fire, forgotten by time, erased from the record. But what if that's only half the story? What if they never truly disappeared, only changed form? In the shadowed woods and windswept hills of ancient Britain, the Druids were the voice of the land. They spoke for the rivers, the stones, the stars. They had no temples, no scrolls, only memory, passed from breath to breath beneath sacred oaks. When Rome came, it didn't just crush armies, it tried to crush belief. And yet, the mist never lifted. Even today, their presence lingers nesque murs, in the quiet hush before sunrise, in the rhythmic turning of seasons, in stories told beside fires on solstice nights. It's in the way children dance around maypoles, in the rituals that survived beneath Christian robes, in the names whispered in old tongues no longer spoken. Did the Druids truly die when Rome torched their groves? Or did they slip into legend, myth, and the bloodline of culture? This isn't just a story about loss, it's a story about endurance. Because history isn't always written in stone. Sometimes it grows in forests, sometimes it hides in songs, sometimes it survives in silence. And now, centuries later, the question still hangs in the air, like fog on a sacred hilltop. What really happened to the Druids? The Roman Empire was built not just on stone, but on silence. The kind of silence left behind when cultures are buried, languages are lost, and memory is burned. The Druids stood in direct opposition to everything Rome represented. They worshipped no emperor, obeyed no written law, paid no tribute in coin, only in wisdom. They were the heartbeat of Celtic resistance, not with armies, but with identity. And that made them dangerous. So Rome declared war, not just on a people, but on a worldview. It began with fire. Sacred groves, places where Druids had gathered for centuries, were torched. Altars were smashed. Oral teachings, preserved for generations by memory alone, vanished with the deaths of those who held them. Without scrolls, the knowledge could not be reconstructed. Without temples, it could not be defended. And yet the greatest destruction wasn't physical, it was symbolic. On the island of Mona, the spiritual capital of Druidism, the Roman legions landed with cold precision. Tacitus, the Roman historian, recalled the terror of the soldiers as they faced black-robed figures chanting from the cliffs, women shrieking prophecies, arms outstretched toward a sky thick with smoke. The legions hesitated, not from weakness but from fear. Fear that they were crossing not just a sea, but into something sacred and irreversible. But orders prevailed. The soldiers advanced. They slaughtered everyone. Mona burned. And with it something ancient died. Rome never truly understood what it was destroying. That was never the goal. Eradication was easier than comprehension. To eliminate the Druids was to remove the spiritual glue binding the Celtic tribes, a threat to Roman unification, Roman narrative, Roman control. In the end, the Druids were not just wiped out, they were made to vanish from history's memory. No monuments, no graves, no voices left to tell their side. And for a time, it worked. The forests grew quiet. The solstices passed without song. The bonfires that once lit the hilltops in unison flickered out. Rome had imposed its silence, its laws, its gods. But silence is never permanent, and memory, though buried, has roots. This was not the end of the Druids. It was only the moment they became myths. Rome silenced the Druids. Their groves were reduced to cinders, their chants to whispers. No temples were rebuilt, no sacred books were recovered. To most historians, that would mark the end. But culture is not only housed in stone, it breathes through people, and in this case, it adapted. Long after the last Druid fell, their ideas, their rhythms, their spiritual imprint remained, hidden in plain sight. The festivals persisted, the Romans renamed them, the Christians rebranded them, but the cycles stayed intact. Imbolc, became Candlemas. Beltane was reshaped into May Day. Samhain, once a Druidic fire festival to honor the dead, transformed into what we now call Halloween. Fires were still lit, offerings still made, not in oak groves, but on kitchen tables, at stone wells, beneath crosses that bore more resemblance to the sun wheel than to any Roman crucifix. And it wasn't just ritual, it was worldview. The Druidic reverence for nature survived in the folklore of saints who tamed wolves, preached to birds, or lived alone in caves wrapped in ivy. Sacred wells remained places of healing. Hilltops, once used for solstice ceremonies, became sites for chapels. The language changed, but the song remained. In Ireland, Wales, Brittany, rural communities still whispered legends of wise women, forest healers, and men who knew the stars. They were no longer called Druids, they were monks, midwives, and wanderers. But they filled the same role: keepers of memory, protectors of balance, interpreters of the invisible. Rome had intended to erase, instead it unknowingly planted seeds. Because Druidism was never built on structure, it was built on flow. Like water, it slipped through the cracks of empire, soaked into the soil, and re-emerged in new forms. What Rome could burn, it could not bind. This quiet endurance reshaped European spirituality. Even today, the eightfold wheel of the year, rooted in Druidic seasonal rites, is celebrated by neo-pagans and spiritual seekers across the globe. The solstices still draw crowds to ancient stones. The equinoxes are marked in festivals, often without knowing why. But the echo remains. The Druids may have lost their voices, but they never lost their place. Because what survives is not always what stands tallest, it's what runs deepest. And in the land, in the language, in the lore, the Druidic soul still stirs. Centuries passed. The Romans were gone, their roads cracked, their statues crumbled, their empire reduced to echoes. But the Druids, those shadowy figures once feared, once hunted, remained absent. Or so it seemed. Then, in the swirling fog of the 18th and 19th centuries, something stirred. Across Europe, a new fascination with the mystical past took hold. Romantic poets, antiquarians, and spiritual seekers looked beyond Christianity's cathedrals and Roman ruins. They searched for something older, something wild, rooted, forgotten, and in that search, they found the Druids once more. But what they found wasn't entirely what had been lost. This was the birth of Neo-Druidism, a movement not of historical certainty, but of spiritual yearning. Inspired by Celtic mythology, fragments of folklore, and whispers from the earth itself, modern Druids began to reimagine what had been taken. They created rituals drawn from seasonal cycles, wrote prayers to sun and moon, gathered in stone circles under solstice skies. Was it historically accurate? Not entirely. Was it powerful? Absolutely. The Druid revival was not about reconstruction. It was about reconnection. It asked, what if we've lost something essential in the age of steel and speed? What if the ancient reverence for nature, balance, and myth holds truths science cannot explain? And what if the wisdom the Romans tried to erase was exactly what the modern world needs? Today, Druid orders exist around the world. From Glastonbury to New York, individuals gather not to worship gods of empire, but to honor trees, rivers, stars, and ancestors. They call it a return not just to Druidry, but to a way of seeing, a lens that values mystery over certainty, intuition over control, belonging over domination. And yet, questions remain. Is this revival the echo of something real or a modern projection of longing? Are today's Druids the spiritual heirs of an ancient priesthood, or seekers shaping myth into meaning? Perhaps the answer lies not in fact, but in faith. Because whether reborn or reinvented, the Druidic spirit is no longer silent. It sings, through rituals once lost. It marches through forests that remember. It rises, once more, in robes not of power, but of purpose. The Druids are no longer hunted. They are returning, not with war cries, but with songs. Not in fire, but in flame. Not in temples of stone, but in the living cathedral of the earth itself. So, did the Druids really disappear? The Romans burned their groves, they silenced their chants, they smashed their altars. But what they could not erase was the spirit behind it all. The Druids may have lost their place in public record, but they never lost their place in human memory. Through fire and silence, their ideas survived. Through conquest and collapse, their wisdom flowed underground, resurfacing in rituals, in folklore, on forgotten hillsides and rising stone circles. And now, centuries later, we find ourselves returning, not with swords, but with questions, not to rule over the sacred, but to understand it. The Druids remind us that not all power lies in thrones or temples. Sometimes it lies in knowing the winds, the moons, the rhythms of the earth. Their stories are not just about what has been lost, but also about what refuses to be forgotten. What if the Druids never really disappeared, but simply changed shape? Their wisdom may still whisper in the wind, echo in our traditions, and live on in the stories we pass on. Now it's your turn to speak up. Have they been lost to time, or do they live on through memory and legend? Share your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear from you. If this story resonates with you, like this video, subscribe to Whispering Myths, and ring the bell. Because history isn't always written in stone, sometimes it lives on in silence, waiting patiently for someone to remember.